So this presentation is going to be about the effect of socioeconomic status on intimate relationships. I think it's important to discuss what socioeconomic status, or SES, is. It can be simplified as an individual's access to materials and resources. Some areas that SES encompasses are education, employment, income, and assets. So someone who is, they have their doctorates, they have their masters, they're employed 40 hours or more a week, they make a lot hourly, or they get a large salary, and maybe they have home ownership or own a couple different properties. That's going to be somebody that exhibits high socioeconomic status, versus someone who maybe only has their GED, unemployed, or they're making minimum wage, they don't own their own home or any properties. That's going to be somebody that exhibits low socioeconomic status, or SES. So how does SES affect marriage? There's a lot of evidence that indicates as SES increases, so does the likelihood of a successful marriage. And we know that people that are of a higher SES, they tend to take a little bit longer to actually get married. But once they do get married, they run into less hiccups. They don't have as many problems. And that translates to a happier, healthier, longer marriage. People of lower socioeconomic status, if they get married, they tend to get married right away and they have more problems. The likelihood of divorce is higher, but it's not even likely that they get divorced, or it's not even likely that they get married in the first place. Education is also shown to be a pretty big influence when it comes to the likelihood of a successful, long-lasting marriage. Some statistics here: women with a college degree are between 12 and 17% more likely to marry, and those women that are college educated, if they do decide to get married, they're about 40% less likely to have a divorce. Socioeconomic status in marriage. So what are some of the characteristics that are associated with higher divorce rates and lower rates of marriage? These characteristics include lower household income, higher levels of perceived financial stress, lower levels of assets, home ownership, property ownership, and lower levels of education. And these characteristics are all characteristics that are also shared with people of lower socioeconomic status. So now that we have an understanding of the correlation between people of higher SES and higher likelihood of successful marriage, we're going to go into why that is. So one theory that goes into that in detail is the seminal crisis theory. This is the idea that external stress to a couple can bring partners either closer together or further apart, depending on the resources that they have available to cope with those stressors. So there's two areas to the seminal crisis theory. The first one is going to be how external stress can directly influence the content between two couples. For example, if you have a couple that is experiencing a lot of financial stress, they're going to be spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to combat that financial stress. You know, how can I pay the bills? Maybe I should take a second job. They're going to be focusing on things like that, putting a lot of time and effort in combating that financial stress, instead of, you know, spending time with each other, focusing on each other and their relationship and creating a more intimate relationship. So that's how external stress can directly influence the content of interactions between a couple. Now, external stresses can also inhibit or enhance the quality of interactions between a couple. Using the same example, you have a couple that is going or that has a lot of financial stress. Since they're so stressed out, they might have problems empathizing with each other, you know, seeing each other's point of view or perspectives, and that can cause arguments, that can cause trouble solving problems, and that can eventually cause them drifting apart more than you know, drifting together. Now, people of a higher socioeconomic status, they're going to have more access to resources, more access to materials, more access to money a lot of the time. And when they're faced with financial stress or illness or any kind of external stress, they're not going to be as adversely affected as somebody of a lower socioeconomic status. So the chances of them being pushed together are a lot higher than being ripped apart. Now, someone of a lower socioeconomic status, they're not going to have as many resources or as many materials available to them. So chances are financial stress, illness, that's going to rip them apart rather than push them together, causing more of an unhealthy relationship than a healthy relationship. Now we're going to dig into how socioeconomic status affects mate selection. So we all know that a large part of selecting a partner comes down to personality traits and compatibility. If you don't have anything in common with someone and you don't like their personality, chances are you guys aren't going to have a very successful relationship or even try to have a relationship. So there's a lot of evidence that shows there's some personality traits that come from being either in a higher or lower socioeconomic status. So people of a low SES, they typically portray traits of better judgment of emotions of strangers, prone to experiencing other related emotions such as compassion, love, and awe, sensitivity to environmental cues, increasingly interdependence with other people. And they also spend more time socializing in comparison to people of a higher SES. Now, people of a higher SES, they're more prone to experiencing self-related emotions like content, pride, developing habits of self-focus, expectations of control. They tend to be a little more career-oriented, and they spend more time alone in comparison to people of lower socioeconomic status. So we know that the traits are directly affected when it comes to SES, which can cause some barriers between the two. Socioeconomic statuses. So that's why you don't see a lot of like cross-class relationships, and we'll go into that in further detail. But another thing socioeconomic status has influence over is where these relationships are formed. So there's a lot of evidence that shows lower SES individuals are more likely to meet in settings that exhibit their disadvantages. Things like public spaces, parks, bars, community functions. In comparison, you have people of higher socioeconomic status, they're more likely to meet in settings that exhibit their advantages. So these are going to be private spaces, private clubs, business, work parties, things that they're typically invited to. So that creates another barrier on top of the traits that these two classes would exhibit. So this is a pretty complex topic. We're going to dig into how socioeconomic status influences the disparity between genders. So we know that gender ratio directly influences the dynamics of an intimate relationship. What that means, if there's more men than women, that's going to influence the relationship differently than if there's more women than men. So generally people tend to select partners of the same socioeconomic class or status, and that actually makes socioeconomic status a primary factor when it comes to deciding the disparity of gender. So higher and lower, or the highest and the lowest socioeconomic statuses are primarily male. So at the very top of the ladder and at the very bottom of the ladder, it's mostly men, more men than there are women. What that means is when there is more men versus women, men have to compete for men have to be more competitive because there's not as many women that are available. So that's going to cause men to be more competitive, women can be more selective, and men are going to be more open to long-term commitments. And they're going to be more likely to meet the demands for fidelity from women. Now, if you flip that around, when you start talking about socioeconomic status kind of in the middle, not the very top, not the very bottom, but in the middle, there's more women than there are men. So now women have to be more competitive, men can be more selective, and this leads to men taking commitments a little more lightly since they have a larger variety of choices. And women have a fewer alternatives, so they're a little more likely to be accepting of infidelity as a cost to having a desirable partner, or they're either going to withdraw from a long-term relationships with men altogether. So that's kind of how socioeconomic status plays a part when it comes to disparity between genders and the inner dynamics of a relationship when it comes to the disparity between genders. And lastly, we have cross-class relationships. There's not a lot of studies when it comes to cross-class relationships. So we see that there is a steady decline in cross-class relationships. The studies that discuss whether or not cross-class relationships are successful are very rare. And I think this is due to the barriers that we see when it comes to cross-class relationships. These include differences in taste, habits, personality traits that you have between higher and lower socioeconomic status. So that's going to create some barriers. It's going to make it a lot harder for these relationships to even start. Now, when you do see the rare instance of a cross-class relationship, it's going to be mainly due to an individual's attraction to traits that they themselves do not have or exhibit or feel like they're missing. It's kind of the opposites attract idea. So an example of this is someone who is of a higher socioeconomic status being attracted to somebody who is exhibiting more spontaneous expressive traits or a deeper family intimacy, since that tends to be exhibited more from lower socioeconomic status individuals than higher socioeconomic status individuals. So overall, we really don't know if cross-class relationships are successful. We know that there's not a lot of them because there's a lot of barriers that create them from happening. So in conclusion, just to kind of wrap everything up, we know that SES affects likelihood of marriage and why, including, the seminal crisis theory. We know that it affects how relationships are formed, depending on the traits that somebody has, depending on their SES, where relationships are formed. Is it a private place? Is it a public place? And how SES affects that. Relationship dynamics and how SES affects, the gender disparity, and then cross-class relationships. And then these are my references that I used. So that should wrap everything up when it comes to the effect of socioeconomic status on intimate relationships. Thank you.